Hello and welcome to Glasgow Doors Open Day's Digital Festival. This event will begin soon, but first we have a brief housekeeping message. So that you can get the most out of this session, we'd like to point out a few features of Zoom. By clicking on the buttons at the bottom of the Zoom window, you will be able to access the chat room, and if you are in a webinar, you will also be able to make use of the Q&A function. The Q&A function is so that you can ask specific questions of the speaker, which they will be able to answer time allowing at the end of the session. Use the chat room to contribute more generally to the discussion or to share links and resources. When using these features, please mind your P's and Q's. Both will be monitored and recorded. Most sessions will be recorded and uploaded to Glasgow Doors Open Days Festival YouTube channel and website. If you're in a meeting, please make sure you keep your microphone on mute unless otherwise directed by the host. If for some reason the session ends unexpectedly or you lose connection, please just click the link again and wait to be let back in. Similarly, if the host loses connection, please bear with us. We will do our best to manage any connection issues as and when they occur, and may contact you by email if necessary. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'd love to hear about your experience of our digital festival. Fill out our survey to be in with a chance of winning a prize. Our survey is available at www.glasgowdoorsopendays.org.uk/survey. We hope you enjoy this event.
Hi everyone, welcome to this evening's webinar, The Complexities of Commemorating Difficult Heritage, which is part of the Glasgow Doors Open Days Festival. I'm Dr. Rosie Spooner. I'm a lecturer in Information Studies at the University of Glasgow, and I'm going to be facilitating this evening's panel discussion and have the absolute pleasure of being in dialogue with three fantastic panelists who I'm going to introduce in due course. I thought I'd say just a few words at the beginning just to kind of set the tone for this evening's webinar. It's a panel discussion, but the emphasis is very much meant to be on it being conversational, discursive, and exploratory. I don't think that we're going to kind of reach any hard and fast answers to the question of how difficult heritage might be commemorated, but instead the aim is really to open up the topic of conversation, a topic of conversation which has become quite heated in recent months, and make space for nuanced analyses and dialogue. Before introducing the panelists, I'm going to just say a couple of thank yous. Firstly to Stephen Sheriff, who's the festival coordinator for the Glasgow Doors Open Days Festival, and also to Cassie Dillon, who's the Cultural Activities Coordinator in the College of Arts at the University of Glasgow. Both Cassie and Stephen have been incredibly helpful and have given a lot of their time and expertise to helping bring this event together. So I wanted to thank them right at the outset. So I'll now move on to introducing our three panelists. And perhaps as I go through in order, they could turn on their videos, which will then help attendees kind of put faces to names. So firstly, Dr. Peggy Brunash. Dr. Brunash is a lecturer in Atlantic slavery at the University of Glasgow and is based in the history department there. Born in Miami to Haitian parents, she trained and has worked extensively as a historical archaeologist with a focus on plantation studies, the African diaspora and the transatlantic slave trade, and has worked on archaeological projects in Benin, in West Africa, Guadeloupe in the Caribbean, and also numerous sites throughout the United States of America. Dr. Brunash also serves as the newly appointed and first director of the University of Glasgow's new Ben Eva Centre for Slavery Studies. And then second, we have Ashanti Harris. So Ashanti is a multidisciplinary visual artist and researcher working with dance, performance, and sculpture. With a focus on recontextualizing historical narratives, Ashanti's work dissects epistemologies of mobility. So she thinks very carefully about the movement of people, ideas, and things, as well as the social implications of the wider social context in which those mobilities took place. As part of her creative practice, she is a co-director for Project X, a creative education program platforming dance and performance from the African and Caribbean diaspora. And she also works collaboratively as part of the collective Glasgow Open Dance School, or GODS, facilitating experimental movement workshops and research groups. And then thirdly, we have Adesola Ramsey. Great. So Adebusola is a Glasgow-based visual artist and independent researcher. Her artistic practice has developed extensively over the last 2 decades, focusing primarily on abstract painting, but also more recently moving towards incorporating screen printing and text-based work. She is inspired by life experiences, natural and fabricated forms, colors, patterns, and symbols. In tandem with painting, over the last 5 years, Adebusola has been researching the history of chattel slavery, processes of racialization and racism, and Black radical traditions of resistance in opposition to structures of racism and oppression. From 2016 to 2018, she co-led walking tours in Glasgow city centre, highlighting the historical links between the city's built environment and transatlantic chattel slavery, colonization, and empire. So I think just those 3 brief intros, I think hopefully gives you a sense of why I think these 3 panelists have a huge amount of knowledge and expertise to bring to this subject of difficult heritage and how that might be commemorated in the public realm. Their distinct but also overlapping areas of expertise enable nuanced consideration of when it might be appropriate to commemorate issues or instances of challenging history, but also when it might not be. What positives might come out of commemorating difficult heritage, but equally well, what might be the pitfalls and potentially the negative consequences of doing so. So really thinking through the affordances and also the tensions, I think, of commemoration, specifically the commemoration of difficult or challenging histories. And when I say these terms, I'm referring to histories that may involve violence, they may involve oppression, conflict, prejudice, and perhaps trauma. This evening's discussion addresses a particular type of challenging history, and we're talking about displays of living foreign peoples. That was kind of mentioned in the brief blurb that was in the Glasgow Doors Open Day brochure and also on the Eventbrite. These displays of living foreign peoples, or spectacles of otherness, they're also sometimes referred to as human zoos or ethnographic villages, were extremely popular in the late 19th and early 20th century. They were meant to be pseudo-educational, but I think in actual fact, they were definitely meant to be instances of entertainment for predominantly white audiences. I think this is incredibly challenging history to be talking about. And this, as I said, it was an incredibly popular phenomenon, and that phenomenon didn't go unseen in Glasgow. Glasgow wasn't kind of left out of this form of entertainment. Examples of this include Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which included a very large group of Indigenous people from Turtle Island or the continent of North America. Musicians and artists from the Indian subcontinent who traveled to Glasgow and participated in the international exhibitions that were held in Kelvin Grove Park in 1888 and 1901. And then a third example, but definitely not a final example, are what were referred to as the Equator and Arctic villages, which were part of the Scottish Exhibition of National History, Art and Industry, also held in Kelvin Grove Park, but in 1911. This was kind of a slightly smaller scale version of the larger international exhibitions that were held in the park in 1888 and 1901. This last example, the Equator and the Arctic villages that were part of the Scottish National Exhibition of 1911, is really kind of the catalyst for this evening's discussion, in large part because there's very little public awareness that these things existed. There is a degree of public awareness about Buffalo Bill, and he traveled to Glasgow, and there's a statue in Denniston that marks it. But I think there's very little understanding and awareness of these equator and Arctic villages, these ethnographic villages that were in Glasgow in 1911. So what were these things exactly? These were ostensibly authentic views of villages that would have been populated by people from West Africa, in the case of the Equator Village, and then by people from Northern Europe, specifically an indigenous group called the Sami, and they populated what was referred to as the Arctic Village. These two villages sat side by side one another in Kelvin Grove Park as part of the exhibition. And the individuals who were part of these villages, as far as I'm aware, lived on site in Kelvin Grove Park for the full 6 months of the exhibition. The Equator Village, or West African Village alone, was populated by over 100 people, women, men, and also children. So we can expect the same to be the case with the Arctic Village and the group of Sami who lived there. These were fabricated villages. They were meant to show an authentic view of what life was like in the equator and the Arctic regions of the world, but they were, of course, totally constructed. And they were constructed by exhibition organizers, largely for apparently the education of exhibition goers. But I think it's quite telling that these villages were located in the part of the exhibition grounds that were dedicated to rides and amusements and that kind of thing. So they weren't near the art galleries, they weren't near the archaeological displays, the kind of educational, the serious bits, the type of things that we might expect to see at museums, for example. But instead, they were in a different part of the exhibition where there were rides and there were games. So the kind of fairground type of environment. That's where these two ethnographic villages were located, which I think says a lot about how these villages were actually meant to be perceived by exhibition goers, the majority of whom would have been local Glaswegians or people living in surrounding areas. So we're talking about predominantly white audiences here. I first became aware of these things when I was doing my PhD work. I did my PhD about Glasgow's international exhibitions, looking at the history of them through a distinctly post-colonial lens. And ever since, I've kind of wrestled with, on the one hand, feeling very strongly that there needs to be an increased awareness that they existed and they existed in Glasgow. But on the other hand, acknowledging that there is real potential to cause harm by doing so, because we're talking about displays of people, which perhaps came about through coercive circumstances. We're not really sure. So this fact cannot really be avoided. It can't be skirted around. This is the reality of that history. And so I believe it's important to increase awareness of the West African and the Arctic villages, or the West African and Sami villages that were part of the Scottish National Exhibition of 1911, and also understanding the legacies of these things. It's not just about the past, it's also about how we deal with these things in the present. But talking about them in ways that are attentive to their complexities and sensitive to, I think, the deeply problematic nature of them. So understanding the history of these events, these spectacles of otherness, requires, I think, that we ask why. Why did displays or exhibits of living foreign people take place, and what might explain their popularity? As I said before, they were incredibly popular forms of public entertainment in the late 19th and early 20th century. What might explain that popularity? I think that's a really important question to ask, and that helps us get towards an understanding of these things. And so Peggy, as a historian of slavery, but specifically as a scholar who approaches the history of slavery through a social and cultural lens, perhaps you could speak to this question of why, and maybe offer a guess or a supposition or a hypothesis as to what might explain the popularity of these things. Oh, Peggy, could I just ask you to unmute your mic for a second?
There we go. Okay. start again. Thank you, Rosie, and thank you to everyone who's attending alongside Ashani and Busola and myself, and as well as Cassie. Now, that question requires an understanding that this was not a specific or a unique phenomenon to Britain. The same type of exposition, as we call it in the States, happened in 1893. Very similar types of entertainment, educational entertainment values, but all it ended up doing was demonstrating the might of American imperialism. So very much the same happening over here of British imperialism. It at best demonstrated a type of paternalism, but very much rooted in cultural and, let's not shy around it, racial superiority. The idea of making the world smaller, bringing what is foreign to you closer, I don't think there's a problem with that. However, the way it occurred only demonstrated that this was a way to demonstrate to the general public the superiority of either Britain or America as a global power. To be very coarse about it, it is the same situation that happens in the movie King Kong, right? They go out to find this foreign menacing monster. They bring it back as a form of entertainment, but also to demonstrate how it has how they, and so we could see it as either America or Britain, has control over nature, and there's always this idea that people from countries in West Africa, people who are still living in pre-industrial settlements are closer to nature. So it's another form of our control over nature and how we can display this supposedly for education, but as you stated, very much in terms of control and entertainment.
Remind myself to unmute my mic there. Yeah, so it sounds, would you say that it was almost, although these things, these instances were promoted to exhibition goers, to audiences as being educational for them, they were learning about other cultures, as you say, people from afar who were being brought to, in this case, Glasgow. But actually, if you were kind of going to read these things against the grain, I suppose, would you say that the aim was actually more to do with reinscribing notions of superiority? It was more to do with the exhibition organizers, or actually more to do with audiences than it was to do with these individuals who, in this case, were being brought to Glasgow, but could have been brought to Chicago in 1893, Paris in the 1890s as well. Would you say it had kind of had more to do with perceptions of self in a way?
Very much. This was a kind of self-congratulatory performance. Look at what we've brought for you as entertainment. There's nothing to fear. You can look upon them and learn something, but also, if you wanted, you could throw things at them, laugh at them. It's a very self-congratulatory spectacle that they're doing, or that they had done.
Yeah. And so I think this kind of brings me to my second question. So having kind of thought a little bit about what these things were and why they were popular, why they took place. So bringing these spectacles of otherness into the present, we've kind of talked about them in the past in a historical context, but bringing them into the present, what do we think, like what can we do with this history? What do we do with the knowledge that these things took place, and they took place here in Glasgow? I think that question of it being cited here within our locality is really important. Adebusola, given your work leading walking tours of Glasgow city centre and focusing on the area's connections to transatlantic trade and chattel slavery, could I perhaps direct this question to you in the first instance, since you have considerable experience of not only researching a similarly challenging history, and perhaps a challenging history that is interlinked here, which you might also want to speak to, but then also considerable experience of talking about that challenging history within the public realm. So you've got experience of talking with people about this. What do you think that we can do with this historical knowledge? You know, these things existed, but what do we kind of do with that information?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Rosie, and thank you for the invite into this panel. And yeah, and it's great. Thank you to everyone else who's joining in the audience as well as come along to this, as well as the other panelists. What do we do with it? It's hard for me not to give a very simple, straightforward answer to this, but to kind of think of it, just following on from what Peggy has already told us, in that the purpose of these things was to display the might and to the superiority, and to reinscribe this thing, which was a buy-in into whiteness. It was an education into white supremacy, essentially, and so that you could recognize your position in whiteness, and see yourself as different and other to these people. And so what do we do? Because for me, I feel like context matters, right? Particularly when we're talking about history. And so the context here is racialized chattel slavery, then colonization of Africa. And I think in terms of thinking about what was in the heads of the curators and the producers of the Human Zoo at Kelvin Grove Park, they tell you exactly what they were thinking in their kind of brochure for the event. They describe what their impression of Africa is and anything else. And so if that is the context, if the context is racialization, chattel slavery, and colonization, these are all actions of demonstrating power. These are all actions of exploitation, actions of oppression, actions of total extraction of life. And so now that you know what the history is, what are you going to do about it? Because just knowing the history because of what the history is not good enough. What the history tells us and shows, in fact, is one of damage, right? And one of trauma and one of violence. And so once we know that, then it's, what do you do about it? Once you know that damage has occurred, then are you going to repair it? Are you going to repair the damage? Are you going to acknowledge the damage and then follow on with an action, which in this case is reparations for the damage that has been caused. So yeah, I feel that knowing the history is not the end of the story. The next bit is, what are you now going to do now that you know? And one thing with this history is that it's clear that we're going round and round in circles with it. Each generation comes to it fresh. And why is that? Why is it that we here today, those who've never heard of this before, why is this the first time you're hearing that this occurred? Why is this the first time or that you're understanding the extent to which Scotland was involved in the process of transatlantic slavery and also the colonization of Africa and also its empire building and imperialism? Why is that? Why are we just only finding that out now? And it's clear that each generation goes through a successive each successive generation goes through a process of obfuscation and a kind of organized forgetting. And we know that that forgetting and that obfuscation of the history is in and of itself a process of white supremacy, that unseeing restructuring and then seeing anew again. And so we know that coming to the history fresh is in and of itself a distraction from the act of reparations. So my question is, how do we repair all the ways in which the world and its peoples and cultures have endured a total extraction and a deadly exploitation of lives, of cultures, and the very environment we all share, i.e. the earth? How do we go about repairing that now that we know that this is what happened? Now that we know that our world is based on an ideology of anti-Blackness, how do we think otherwise as we work to bring about an abolition of this order, of this current world order? And how do we make a new world order that is cognizant of the damage that has been done and how we got to that damage? That's, I think, my sort of semi-answer to your question.
Yeah.
I hope I answered that.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, yeah, very clearly, I think, knowing the history is not, it doesn't end there. It's not like, oh, I know the history now, so.
Yeah, and then what?
And then what?
And then what? So now you know what you're going to do.
What are you going to do? And for you, it is about this process of repair and a stress on process, repair, reparations, reparative justice, reconciliation. Those things do not happen quickly. These are careful processes that take place over time. What do you see a place in those processes of repair or reconciliation? Do you see a place for kind of, public commemorations? Broadly speaking, we're not necessarily just talking about putting up a statue. I think, we're maybe beyond that. But maybe we're not actually. Do you see a place for something like that, something that exists within the public realm as fitting within a process of repair or a reconciliative process? Or is it kind of, it's not sufficient, and so, is it really worth embarking on? Do you see it as being valuable to that process, I suppose?
Yeah, I think having these nuanced conversations about the commemoration and memorialization is really important, because because you want to approach it with a ethics of care, to borrow, to quote and cite Christina Sharp. I was looking at the definition of the word commemorate, and essentially it implies an action or activity involving the honouring and the memory of a thing. And so, yes, absolutely, there is a place for that, because so many premature deaths is a major factor in anti-Blackness. And so, so many people, so many lives have been lost through this behavior. And yes, absolutely, they need to be honoured and memorialised. And so it has an important part to play. But it's how you then go about doing that. But I suppose what we don't want to do is end up in a situation where we've got commemorations all over the place, but we are still living in a global anti-Blackness. We still have racial capitalism. We still have oppression and exploitation that is racialized and systematic. So it's like the commemorations sit hand in hand with that still going on. So it's almost like you need to move things in tandem. The commemoration can only really happen sincerely. Are you really honoring the people who you oppressed and the lives that you traumatized and damaged, if you are still doing the very thing that is generating more of those instances? And so the commemoration in and of itself is an acknowledgement. It comes with an acknowledgement and a repair, because what does it mean to truly honor those lives that were extracted for the purpose of building this current world order? So yeah, that's kind of what I've been thinking about.
Yeah, and I think that that issue or that topic of honoring, I think, is actually perhaps more useful than the word commemorate, which can mean a lot of different things. I suppose honoring can as well, but it perhaps has a greater sense of sincerity, which you emphasized, the word honoring. And so actually, I think this is a perfect segue to bring in Ashanti, because Ashanti, in your work, you kind of have a long-term project that you're working on called the Forgotten Diaspora Project. And I hope I'm right in saying that part of that involves an honoring of presence, and specifically in your case, primarily women from the African and Caribbean diaspora who were in Scotland at some point. They may have lived here on a long-term basis, short-term basis, moved through it quickly. But my understanding of the Forgotten Diaspora Project of your work is that it's very much about honoring these women's experiences and their historical presences within Scotland. So perhaps I could turn to you and ask what you think about this question of a commemoration or an honoring, and whether that is something that is fitting or appropriate in the specific context of these ethnographic villages that we know were in Kelvin Grove Park in 1911.
Yeah, thanks Peggy. Thanks Peggy and Basola as well for your thoughts so far. There's so much to draw from. But yeah, so as Rosie was saying, a lot of the research I've been doing recently has been looking at the presence and legacies of women of African and Caribbean heritage in Scotland over the 18th and 19th centuries. Alongside this, before that, I was doing a master's, which was specifically exploring African and Caribbean dance in Scotland as well. And I think in both of these kind of research processes, it's essentially been processes of a lot of silences. It's kind of listening really, really hard for things that are barely there, and kind of like trying to find meaning in the silences. And the processes that I've been working with are kind of when sort of historical records, archival documents leave you with a name, a date, a word, a journey, and that's kind of all you have. How do you start to fill in the gaps and add the information? And I think a really important thing to know, which also kind of ties in with what Basola was talking about, is this relationship between the past and the present. So when you're thinking about difficult histories, it's kind of like there's the question of how do we commemorate and honor and acknowledge them, but also what does that mean when essentially the reverberations of those histories are still having effect now. And it's kind of, I think it's the same with kind of how do you look back? And I think when the reverberations of those histories do have such a presence in the present, then also that process of kind of speculating the present is the best the best place to start. So in a lot of that, this is actually Basola has worked with me on this project a lot. It's been a really key source of knowledge and experience as well. But we did, so one of the parts of this project was working with women of African and Caribbean heritage who are living in Scotland now, to look at this history and think about this history together, but also think about how we hold this history in our experiences of these spaces. I mean, thinking in relation to Kelvin Grove Park, I mean, I walk through Kelvin Grove Park every day, and of course, like the ethnographic village isn't still there, but it's kind of how do these experiences and histories kind of have a physical presence. There's what does it mean to walk down a street that's named after a plantation owner? What does it mean to be in a building that only exists at the cost of the lives of people of African and Caribbean heritage? And how do you hold that in your body as a person every day? What does it mean to learn about this ethnographic village, and how is that different depending on what your relationship is to that history and how it affects your other experiences in life? So I think that these are all things that kind of need to be considered, but also in that kind of process, like history history happened, but the way we think about it is made now. The way that we respond to it and act to it is made now. And I think things like this and creating conversations to kind of to speculate, and also for people to kind of think about what it means to them. Like my experiences against Basola's experiences, against Peggy's experiences, against Rosie's experiences is going to be so different. But all of the different ways that we sort of embody and respond to this history is important. So kind of creating these opportunities to kind of to think about it and think about where we individually stand within it. And maybe that's a really good place to start when thinking about this idea of reparations, because I mean, it's kind of like reparations is such a huge thing, and there's this total thing that I think a common thing that happens is this kind of separation of like, oh well, that was the Victorians, that was them, but this is now. But if like really kind of taking time to kind of dissect these reverberations and what that means in response to you as an individual as well, kind of can start to generate kind of ideas of where an individual may suffer or benefit from this history, and also what can be done. And maybe that's something huge, and maybe it's something tiny, but that's, I suppose, like starting to get those conversations going.
Yeah, so maybe something, you know, a kind of an outcome of a commemorative thing or a commemorative act, a commemorative gesture is not so much about commemorating the past, or it is about acknowledging the past, but it's also very much about creating an opportunity to have conversations about that in the present. It's not just about putting up something that's a testament to the past. It's about being a catalyst for conversation in the present, perhaps. Because I think even if we look back to a statue which has got a lot of press recently, the statue of Edward Colston in Colston in Bristol. I used to live in Bristol for a year, a statue I walked by tons of times. That statue being put up in the first place said more to do with Bristol society in that time period than it did about Colston's time, I think, right? So that, I think, we can take with us now. It's more to do with using these things that may exist within the landscape. We may insert them into the landscape actually as a way of thinking through the present, as well as acknowledging the past, I suppose. So I wonder are any of you aware, and I want to kind of open this question up to all three of you, and feel free to jump in whatever way makes sense. But are any of you aware of like comparable examples that we might be able to look to of commemorative gestures or physical monuments, interpreted as broadly as possible, that do sort of manage to both acknowledge a challenging historical event, but then also make it very relevant to the present, and that speak to present concerns, and also speak to kind of a future, a hope for future as well. Are you guys aware of anything that you can think of that would be useful for us to draw on if we wanted to take these conversations further in Glasgow?
If I may proceed, I can think of a couple of examples that I've seen in the French Caribbean in terms of statues. Right, since that has been and continues to be a hot button. There are statues that have been put up to memorialize and commemorate the agency of Black people in the struggle for freedom. I've seen them in terms of in both genders. There is a beautiful one of an enslaved woman who was in Guadeloupe, and she was pregnant and led an actual rebellion. And the statue is of her as one Black enslaved woman who led a rebellion. You see her full, almost to term. The history did not fare well for her. Unfortunately, she was captured, and they let her they let her conceive the child. She gave birth, and then they immediately executed her. That is not what is commemorated. It is the fact that in the state of being heavily pregnant, she is a fist in the air, is leading the way. That is something that, if we're going to talk about just objects, or in particular statues. But I think what Ashanti was saying in terms of trying to create some sort of dialogue, and what you're doing here with us, Rosie, because I don't think it's fallen on anyone that we are 3 women, we're 4 women, 3 of color, of different complexions that span both the Caribbean as well as Africa and here in Scotland. If we're not talking about objects, there needs to be that dialogue that you're talking about. That, I would say, was the problem with these kinds of shows, these expositions, is that, you know, they weren't talking about slavery, but they were still creating or making people of color as objects that are silent, as Ashanti is saying, like, or trying to remove that gag. If a person, the object is too silent, the object does not get to speak back. So even if they had an ethnographic village and allowed some sort of communication between and other visitors that came into Glasgow with those in the ethnographic village, that would have been an interesting situation. Mm-hmm. But instead, they were put there as objects, living objects, and again, still yet another commodity without any say on how they're allowed to shape how others see them. So there needs to be a reciprocity in whatever we do forward. There needs to be communication and the inclusion of whomever we're speaking about. If it's not us, if we're talking about others or learning about others, they need to be included in the construction of that narrative.
Yeah. So that is like, put a question in my brain, but I want to come back to that and actually hear from Abdesola and Ashanti. If you know, are you guys aware, are either of you aware of comparable examples that might be useful for us to reflect on or bring to bear on Glasgow?
I can go. Yeah. Yeah. I'm like, you want to go first? Shall I go first? I mean, I think, oh God, examples of commemorations. I think thinking about how commemoration can take different forms, and I think in terms of actual sculpture, yeah, completely what Peggy said. It's about what's represented and how that can be used to empower people. I know there's a really gorgeous statue in Guyana, the country that I'm from, that's by an artist, a sculptor called Philip Moore, and it's of Cuffy the slave, it's representing a person called ex-enslaved person called Kwamina, who led a slave rebellion in Guyana. And this kind of image of like this titled work is titled Cuffy the Slave, it's in stone and it's carved with all of the different kind of patterns and parts of Guyanese culture, and it really represents like identity and unity and strength, and there's something so wonderful and empowering. And I think really specifically, again, it's like I've seen so many kind of commemorations of slavery that are about like the sadness and the shame, and essentially I suppose like they are to make people feel shame and sad, but then what does that do now, and how does that help now? Whereas there's something in this reminder of like the strength, like that strength is this really, really incredible thing that people who've gone through this history had, and that being something in thinking about the reverberations that can be drawn from, I think that's really important. So that kind of in relation to statues, but also sort of, I mean, I'm saying this as like a person who works with dance and performance and like physical body-centered practices, and I think that also as a form of commemoration as well is a really important thing. Kind of how do histories and stories get shared from person to person, and how's that through storytelling, through singing, through dancing, through performance, through all of these things, and then also how does that generate this kind of like knowledge and information and experience sharing, because it's about physically getting people together and physically kind of processing the commemoration in your bodies, and how that's also a really amazing thing. So things like the new James McCune Smith building, that is a commemoration in itself, but also what's done in that building and what happens in the building, and is also feels like it's part of that, and feels like more positive than something that's kind of about the shame, or like it's like what are you celebrating? Are you celebrating the strength, or are you celebrating, like, are you remembering white supremacy? Like what's helpful in that kind of?
Yeah.
And yeah, I couldn't come up with any brilliant examples. I couldn't find and that's more to do with my research rather than anything what's out there. But one piece of work came to mind, and I don't know if it's necessarily commemorating this history, but it's Simone Lee's Highline, or Brick House, sorry, and it's a sculpture piece of a Black woman incorporating sculpture techniques and styles from West Africa, and it was a statue that was placed in the middle of New York, overhead, so you couldn't miss it, and there was something, I'm just drawn to that, in its situation of Black woman, and just taking up space essentially. But one of the other examples that I came up with, and I'm not sure this is necessarily answering the question of commemoration, but it's about addressing this history and what you do with it and how you engage with it. I recently came across a blog called the Centre for Education for Racial Equality in Scotland, and it was a teacher, an anonymous teacher, has made a post on it, essentially as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement. She decided to take introduce her class and take a subject and discuss the topic with her class of primary school children, and done the research and was trying to engage them with this history and racism, the history of racism and the processes of racism. And she felt it all gone well. And then it was the pushback that she received from parents, and also the lack of support that she had experienced from the actual institution itself. So in a way, I feel like the teacher making the effort to introduce this as part of education, and in a way, I see that as part of the commemoration process, is first of all even acknowledging the thing, and the pushback against that, and the difficulty that that individual teacher experienced, I thought was something very interesting to note, is that when you are trying to take a critical approach in how you choose to commemorate, there will be pushback, because what you're essentially doing is going against the status quo. If you are centering blackness and you're trying to not replicate anti-blackness, you're essentially going against status quo, and that can cause some issues. And lastly, well, I give this example, but bearing in mind what I recently heard, a quote from Priyamda Gopal, the academic and writer, said recently that let us not, hold on, let me just get it so I'm not misquoting her, sorry. She essentially said that that we needed to be careful not to, it's very important to not simply museumize colonialism. And so I give this quote just, you know, for this other option that I'm going to give, which I thought was a really good idea, which was the Museum of British Colonialism. And this is a joint project, a joint UK and Kenyan initiative that's founded to creatively communicate a more truthful account of British colonialism. And yeah, so those were the kind of examples that I had to share, but I'm not sure they're necessarily doing exactly the same thing that Peggy and Ashanti mentioned earlier on, but those are my contributions.
Definitely, you know, if we go back to that, the concept of, you know, it's not just about saying, oh, this history happened. It's also about creating space for education, for conversations. Those examples which you just brought forward do exactly those things. You know, the Museum of British Colonialism, it is, you know, it has such a strong, it's an educational program. And so I think, yeah, they're absolutely relevant. If it's not just about saying this thing happened, it's about having an impact on the present, then questions of education are absolutely paramount.
Yeah, and sorry, one other thing I was going to add was that, I can't remember who it was that said it, whether it was Peggy or Ashanti, but involving, we know that the brochure for this ethnographic village or human zoo states exactly which peoples, which cultures people were taken from, that were represented in that situation at Kelvin Grove Park. And it would, I feel like involving the people from those cultures in however we choose to address this history or commemorate would be quite an important thing, because we know who they are and where they were taken from. We've got pictures, you know, children were part of the cohort of people that were exhibited in the park. And so, yes, I would say that we see, you know, we know exactly where these people are. And so can we have a conversation about that history without involving the people from those cultures?
Mm-hmm. Which reminds me of the question which came to mind a wee while ago, and that was, you know, is it potentially about the process that goes into making whatever a commemoration ends up looking like, whatever form it ends up taking? As you said, Ashanti, you know, I think there can be a plurality of forms that a commemoration can take, whether it's a physical thing or an ephemeral thing, but something that is embodied like dance or performance. But is it as important to think about the process and the kind of creative, the generative process as it is what the final thing ends up being? What do all three of you think about that relationship between kind of process and finished thing, finished object, you know, broadly conceived?
Well, I would have imagined that if the Ecuador was not Ecuador, the village that had people coming from various parts of West Africa, I'm sure if they were allowed to have participated and had their say, they would not have chosen to be described as savages
Mm-hmm.
or barbarians. I think just that alone, right? That language that is used to other them and racialize them in a manner that is so inferior to whiteness I'm sure they would have said, let's redress how you describe us and let us tell you how we see ourselves. And we can have a conversation about that. You may not agree, but we can have a conversation. At least allow whomever is supposed to be the object be a participant and a subject to help influence whatever the final product's going to be.
And do either Ashanti or Busola, would you like to kind of continue that thread, thinking about process versus outcome?
Yeah, I mean, I just have to agree. I think that's a lot. Yeah, I just completely agree. It's kind of in general, how can you speak to how can you speak to someone else's experiences? Really, it's like you need the person who the experience relates to be part of the conversation. It's, I suppose, like, or else it's just continuing this kind of the colonial kind of hierarchical process of essentially like knowing the other, and essentially this assumption that one, like, if somebody who's not represented represented by the affected by the history knows what that's like, it's just essentially this just the exact same thing happening again. It's like, yeah, we know these people, the savages, and it's kind of, yeah, it's bringing people to the conversation. And I suppose, that's the, yeah, and also even within kind of that history, it's like within that process, this idea that there's also not one voice that can speak for everyone. Like, there's no one Black person that can be the voice of all Black people, and that is kind of something that happens a lot of the time. It's actually really wonderful to be on this panel, because it has to be noted that the majority of the times there will be the kind of token person of color who is representing all people of color, which is just on a panel or in a conversation like this, which just is not, it's not possible. I mean, God, colonialism's massive. How can one person represent every single part of it? So yeah, I think like inviting the voices who the work speaks to, but also like letting it be led by the voice of the people who it speaks to, and having as many people as possible, kind of being wide about it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
What did the Wolof, the Mandingo, the Susus, what did they think of the fact that their kin were brought over to Glasgow? And what did they want to say to Glaswegians about that? And yeah, it's imperative. The process is fundamental, I feel, because as with what happened in Bristol with the Colston statue going down, and then some white artist adding his own statue to, it's essentially a certain authority over the space, which is how I saw that exercise. It's the process is fundamental, and who is involved in the process, and the care that the process takes in addressing those who are affected by the trauma created by the very history that we're talking about, and who's given, as Peggy said eloquently, who's given opportunity to talk, who's given opportunity to lead the process, who's and who is it speaking to, and what is it speaking to? What do you want to come out of it? Is it just is the commemoration in and of itself just another form of entertainment? Is it just for information and you can take it or leave it kind of a situation? And how does that help the mechanisms, as Ashanti said earlier on, the reverberations or the wake that's left, the afterlife of slavery and colonization and empire building. What does it do to redress all of those things, and what room does it leave for discussions about reparations and such like? So yeah, the process is fundamental, and I suppose like the process of reparation, and I know it seems heavy and scary to a lot of people, but at what point are we going to start getting on with it? At what point are we going to start the process? If we understand it's going to take a while and everything, and how are we going to engage all of each other in this process? So yeah, the process is fundamental, because you need to first of all acknowledge the thing and bring everyone up to the same understanding or similar understanding, so that we can all be informed as we're making choices about how to move forward. So yeah, the process is fundamental.
Thank you for that. I'm just looking at the clock at the top of my computer screen. I wonder if I've pulled up the Q&A. Are we kind of ready to sort of perhaps take maybe one or two questions from the Q&A? I know I've been looking very briefly at the chat as well, and some people have had to dash off, although they've said, thank you so much for this conversation. So yeah, do we feel like we're kind of ready to perhaps take one or two questions? Peggy, a thumbs up. Shanti, a thumbs up. Okay. Apologies for attendees. It's really hard to sort of pay attention to both the Q&A and then the conversation at the same time. And my focus was there very much on thinking about the conversation and being in the conversation. So I'm going to kind of pull maybe the odd question from the Q&A at random, and I'm going to do that slightly on the fly. So I apologize to those whose questions might not get voiced or answered. So there's one here. Are there any firsthand accounts from participants, so from those who were part of these ethnographic villages? I imagine that this person is maybe referring specifically to the ones in Glasgow, but we could perhaps expand that, take that further to think about people who were involved in these things that took place in other countries as well, and in other cities. And then also, how were these individuals recruited? First-hand accounts, that's a very difficult topic, because it speaks to the archive, I suppose. It's basically asking, what is in the archive? We've all kind of alluded to like an exhibition catalog and materials. So I think I would like to say to everyone attending that there are very few materials, but they are at the Mitchell Library, and you can go see them as soon as the Mitchell reopens. You can request those. So those materials are there. But I think that question really is about thinking about the archive. So the three of you, are you aware either of firsthand testimonies that may exist about individuals who were part of these ethnographic villages? But if you aren't, can you think of other historical sources that might enable us to get at those silences, as you said, Ashanti, listening really, really carefully to those silences? Can you think of other types of historical sources that might allow us to get there if certain documents are not in the proverbial archive?
I just jumping in with that. So when I was doing research over the last over 2018 and 2019 into the Guyanese women who were in Scotland in the 18th and 19th centuries, and kind of the process of drawing, like moving between the silences and exploring the silences between what was there, that also was a process of what was there, was sifting through a lot of really difficult and painful history, and also first-hand accounts. The first, in relation to the women that I was researching, I suppose there were kind of two extremes. So there were more, I suppose, like there was more information, and I felt like I could get closer to the women who were in of themselves, like huge characters. Maybe they developed a lot of wealth, maybe they were kind of after emancipation developed a lot of wealth and therefore featuring in papers and writing, but still so little of the accounts of these people that definitely featured more in archival documents were first-hand accounts directly from themselves. That was still so rare. And I think the closest I got to coming across first-hand accounts is a document of the person who on the plantations in Berbice in Guyana managed the complaints, and there was a procedure in Berbice that all complaints there was a complaints procedure for enslaved people to essentially file a complaint. And as you can imagine, I mean, if a person whose life is slavery has a complaint, then that's it. Like it's horrible and it's harrowing and it's a lot, and kind of, yeah, it's a lot. It's like a lot to hold. It's a lot to carry, and especially when you're kind of trying to, like, I don't know, like bring something, like draw some kind of like strength or power or like love or connection to these histories, to also kind of physically take yourself through that side of it is really, really painful and difficult and hard. And that's the only kind of first-hand experience, first-hand kind of accounts. And again, that's written, say it's first-hand accounts, it's really interesting because it's written phonetically. It's as in it's trying to be that detailed, but obviously it's being written by, the complaint is being spoken, and there's a person who is, their job is to write down what essentially write down what's being said. And yeah.
I haven't come across any documents, any primary sources in this manner. I would imagine part of the reason is that most people didn't speak any of the indigenous languages of these different ethnic groups coming out of West and Central Africa, even if the colonial language at the time, and still is French. In terms of similar events happening in the United States, such as with the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, there's more about the protests by African Americans. And again, very little to nothing that I've seen in terms of what might have been said by, and again, I can't call them participants. That seems to give the idea of choice in this matter. So unfortunately, that's the best I can say for this.
Yeah, similarly, I'm not aware of any accounts from people who would have participated in these sorts of scenarios. Well, sorry, let me not use that word participate, because Peggy is right. People who were forced into these events and exhibitions, or coerced into these exhibitions. But in terms of slavery history, the Library of Congress has a collection. There was a Federal Writers Project between 1936 and 1938, and it's slave narratives. People who were born into slavery, and so you can hear their accounts or read their accounts. And I suppose another way to get about to how people felt would be looking at what people in these areas who were involved in decolonial, anti-colonial resistance, what they were saying, would give an indication of what people thought during this time. But like Peggy, yeah, I also have an issue with the participants phrasing, and also this concept of how were they recruited. It implies that, you know, you've applied for something, and you know, this reciprocal arrangement, recruitment implies some sort of reciprocal arrangement. And so yeah, I'm not aware of any first-hand accounts of people who would have experienced or being coerced into an ethnographic or human zoo scenario.
Yeah, which I think yeah, speaks to these really significant gaps that we have in like the official archive, the official historical record. I've just realized it's got incredibly dark around me.
And I just wanted to say what you said earlier on about this speaking to the archive is that, yeah, would any of the people who were organising this event, would they have ever been interested in what the Africans there, or the Sami people, or the people from the Highlands, were they interested in what they thought or how they felt or anything like that? And as Peggy was saying earlier on, they were objects essentially to be looked at, to be gawked at, for school trips to be made to, you know, in the way, yeah, so.
Yeah, which I think brings us back perhaps to that question of process, and thinking creatively about how, but as a group of people, not kind of an individual on their own, but thinking, bringing in a plurality of sources, and not just relying on an official institutional record to help us tell that history, because chances are that information that we're looking for is not going to be there. So bringing in other types of sources, oral histories, as you say, Adebasola, that Library of Congress archive is incredible. It's an amazing resource, which I think also then brings us back to this question of education and learning resources and all that kind of thing. It's 7:15. I'm aware of your time. I'm pointing at the three panelists I can see in front of me. I'm aware of your time, and I'm also aware of the time of everyone who's been joining us as attendees on this webinar. So I think, would you say that it's an appropriate time that we maybe wrap it up? I think. I also know that there are other Doors Open Days events happening the rest of this evening, so I don't want to kind of detract from those or take anyone away from those. But as in closing, would each of you like to kind of, is there anything further, actually, that's the appropriate question. Is there anything further that you would like to add to this, what I hope will be the first of many conversations about how and if and whether these ethnographic villages that were in Kelvin Grove Park should be commemorated, and what form of commemoration that might take? Is there anything that you feel is important to add to this first conversation before we wrap things up?
I don't think this is a history that should be forgotten, swept under the rug and said, okay, it was wrong, we shouldn't have done it that way, let's just forget about it. I think this should be incorporated in learnings to demonstrate how the reach of imperialism and ideas of cultural and racial superiority extended long after slavery. This is not the issues that most people are arguing about and fighting in the streets about has so little to do about slavery and everything that's happened after slavery and things that are still happening in terms of slavery. And so when people are saying, well, I mean, how do you know if where they placed the portions of these villages in the exposition means that it's something racist? Well, the fact that in the brochure, there's art there's world civilizations, and then there's entertainment, and guess where the Black folks are? So that alone tells you the start of where these problems arise and how we should think about, while it may have been considered fine and not problematic, we know it is problematic. And it was just a continuation of these ideas about racial and cultural inequalities that keep getting reinforced in different ways through decades, from the 16th century, 17th, 18th, 19th, now we're in the 20th century, and how we need to stop and see how maybe this isn't about slavery anymore. Maybe it's still, maybe we need to change our way of thinking. How, if we were to do this again, how would we do it? And have students talk about this, have other people in the community say, okay, if this was wrong today, how would we do it now? So that we could potentially not be seen as being so wrong by future observers. You know, just being able to talk about it in that sense and work on this in the similar way that we're doing right now in this webinar, I think is just one thing that we could get the ball rolling and should happen.
I'll jump in. I suppose the final comment is there is a lot of commemoration happening at the moment, and there's a lot of honouring and there's a lot of unpicking, and it's taking all of these really amazing and interesting forms. It's taking the forms of artworks, of installations, of writing, of thinking, of events, and actually kind of, I think, promoting this happening more, engaging in it, kind of, and also this idea that where do you get to learn about these things? And like, in absolute honesty, I feel like I learn more thinking about this history in a way that I feel I benefit from looking at one of Adebisola's paintings than I ever did when I was in school. I think it speaks to me more. I've like, and also informs me more, and also promotes this idea of thinking, like actually being active and thinking, like what are you bringing to this? What do you think about that? And I think kind of being open to creativity as a way of engaging with this history and a way of like speaking to this history, and also listening to experiences that sometimes it's not, words are just not the way. Sometimes they can only be communicated through movement, through gesture, through painting, through music, and being open to that as a really important way to engage and also like gain knowledge as well.
Thank you.
I'll jump in at the end. Yeah, I suppose this is a process I've been going on through myself, which is the unlearning and the understanding where I am and how it is this world came to be. How did our ways of knowing and being that we currently work with, how did it all come to be? How did we get here? How did racial ideology start? Who started it? Why? And I suppose it's the critical thinking for me, is thinking critically about what I see around me, and what I believe, what I think I believe, what I think I know. Because one thing that struck me about the history of slavery, the history of racial ideology, the history of colonialism and empire, Western European empire, is just the effort that's been made, and the mechanisms and the machinations that come into play to make us forget, or to make us not see what is actually there, the processes of obfuscation, and so because all over Glasgow, all over Scotland, there are these legacies to this history that are staring us right in the face, but you don't know. And it's the thinking, how to think critically about race, because it's just something we're all just indoctrinated into, and to think otherwise. And I suppose I'm going to bring it up again, is reparations, and it's how do we redress and repair the damage of colonization, the damage, because as we can see, racial capitalism, and it's having an impact. If you don't care about the people, then the actual earth, the climate that you're living in, is being impacted. And so how is it we're going to, and Peggy said a very interesting word earlier on, which was stop. And I suppose the reason we've been having these conversations in the last 6 months or so is because the world had to stop for a virus. And so all of a sudden, Black Lives Matter, which had been going for many years, all of a sudden people could hear what was being said because their world had stopped. You were in the house and you had nothing else to pay attention to. And so it's that stopping. I mean, we've proven now that we can stop the world to keep ourselves safe. Can we stop the world to make a new world order? And can we prioritize this because we value the impact on people's lives? I suppose that's where my head is at now, is what are we going to do now we all know all this stuff? What kind of world is it we want? And if you're happy with the status quo, or you have some sort of issue with a change, then wear your racism on your chest, and just wear it on your chest, and let's all move on. And and so that's where I am at, particularly with Scotland. That's where I am at with Scotland, because it's had to go through this journey of having to become aware of the history that it had obfuscated. So now you know what you're going to do. Because Scotland is in a unique position where it is trying to make a new identity anyway, through considering independence. So who is it you want to be? And what is it you want to be? And what about the damage that you've left in your wake? If we're in the wake of slavery and colonization, well, what about that damage? What are you going to do about it? What do you want to do about it? Or do you want to just wear that history on your chest and just say, yeah, we colonized and we did racism, and yeah, what about it, kind of a thing? It's about time people make those choices, because the round and round that we've been going round in the last 550 years of this, because people have resisted this stuff right from the beginning. And so now we know we've been going round and round and round. Are we going to stop and take a different direction? So that's my final contributions.
And I think that's like a perfect final contribution, because you're ending the conversation by just bringing more questions. Like that is the sign of a good, rich, open conversation, that you leave with more questions than you came to it with. So thank you. I think that was like perfect. And I'm looking in the chat and I can see other people going, oh my God, that is just like the most beautiful sentence I've ever read. So that is the perfect ending, I think. But also your point about thinking critically about the world that we inhabit and the world that we embody, because that is what I think the Glasgow Doors Open Days Festival should be all about, is how allowing us and encouraging us to think critically about our built environment, not just honoring its heritage, honoring the nice architecture. It's about thinking critically about how we exist within it. So I think that's also a really important point to end with, which you brought forward, Additive Sola. So thank you so much. It's 26 minutes past 7. I think we should call it an evening, and let everyone get on with the other things that I'm sure that they want to do, like enjoying the beautiful evening that it is in Glasgow, if you're with us in Glasgow. So I think the only thing that I want to say is just thank you so much to Peggy, Ashanti, and Ade Basola. It's just been an incredibly rich, vibrant, thoughtful, nuanced conversation, and I hope it'll just be the first of many. So thank you so much for your time and your thoughts and your expertise and your knowledge. And thank you to all of our attendees as well. Thank you for your patience and your questions and your comments in the chat. And enjoy the rest of the festival.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.